Okay, so taking my mechanism plate and moving the blade actuating ring anti-clockwise so that this is up against that post, we can flip that over and get our blades in position. Now that means that the shutter is sitting in the blade's open position there. Our first blade there. Second. Third. Fourth and fifth. It's very convenient to have a toothpick that you can manipulate blades with just to help you push them into the right direction. Okay, so there's our blades all seated on there in the open position. Here's our case. This only goes on one way. Now looking at this, get you back in the picture. See, we've got a post coming up here, a screw hole next to it. That post is going to come up through that hole in the case. So we'll just swing this into position. Just check that those screw holes are all lined up and get ready to put the 3 screws in place. Now, countersunk head screws, 3 of them, and they're identical. Run them down lightly. Here's the 3rd one gone. There it is. Flip the shutter over, pull back the blade actuating ring, the blade should close smoothly. And as long as this little tab here, which is activated by your self-timer, is pulled back towards the centre so it clears the blade actuating ring, you should be able to move that and see those blades swing in and out quite cleanly. I can see a little mark on the blade there. Just going to have a dab at that with some naphtha, see if that'll lift off. It looks like a tiny droplet mark where something is sat on that blade. That's not going to lift off. I could lift that off with, take the blade out and polish it. And you can see that mark, it's just right there. I can't really see it when I look straight at it, but it catches the light if I get it at the right angle. Yeah, you can just see it there. I'm going to leave it. Won't affect the function at all. So that's our blades back in. Now we know they move smoothly. I can nip those 3 screws up. And that's the base part of our shutter all back together. And we can start putting in all the control stuff. So while, as you can see, I had second thoughts about that little mark on the shutter blade there, and I pulled those blades back out, polished them with brasso and popped them back in. So now there's no unpleasant looking marks on the shutter blades. I didn't bother videoing that. We've got other shutters to do later, so I'll show you the process then. One of them is bound to have blades that need some attention. So now we need to start putting things back into the shutter. Right, need to clean up a few pieces. These pieces will do for a start. So, more naphtha. Just clean all these surfaces up. This is the lever that adjusts the aperture setting. I'm just making sure there's no dirty sticky grease on the inside of that. This is the shim or spacer. This is, if there's camera's been damp, this piece can be corroded. You might need to polish off any corrosion. This is the setting lever for the self-timer. Of course, this is a Compur rapid shutter, not a synchro Compur shutter, even though basically most of the mechanism is identical, and as such there is no XM flash sync to set. And here is the B lever. Okay, they're clean enough for our purposes. We can start putting things back together. So, springs. First we want the return spring for the B lever. I'll see if I can zoom you in a little bit so you can see a bit more. That should do. So, our return spring is this thing. And it goes on over this post. There's a groove in that post. And swing that spring back out of the way. Now I'm going to open the shutter blades all the way by pushing the blade actuating ring forward. You can take our B lever, hook this into place. What I'm trying to do is catch the spring in this tiny little groove in the base of that lever. There, that's sitting there, sprung loaded, ready to go, ready to fire across the room at any second. We have this spring to go in place. I need to set it in here. Check that my B lever moves. That's moving nicely, so I can pull the B lever back with my finger like this. And I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the park position. Check that the B lever moves. Tighten that screw down. And this spring needs to be lifted over and around to the inside of the lens tube there. So it's now acting against this lever and the other end is against that tube. And that's the B lever in position. Let's blow a bit of fluff out of there. Right, next, this lever. This is what sets the self-timer, and you could lubricate this in a couple of ways, and a handy way of doing it is to take a soft lead pencil, lots of graphite and hardly any clay, just wipe around that inside edge. Now that pin needs to drop down into that gap. here between the spring and the end of that tube. Like that. Our shim here only goes on one way. See if I can get this round the right way first time. You can see it's got a little tab on it here, and there's your slot obviously for here. That tab drops into a notch in the casting there in the body of the shutter. And I'll just move this blade, the aperture settings in slightly. Here's our setting lever for the aperture. Now you can see there's a hole here. That's where our cocking shaft comes through. That runs through this slot here. So that's how you can tell you've got this the right way up. Now we're just catching on stuff there because this sticks up proud of the shutter. So let's just drop that into place. Another block of wood here. I'll see if I'll pop that on there. I'll just have to change the focus of this slightly. That should do. We've got to line up our two little screw holes here and here. And these tiny little screws go in there. And check that the aperture setting moves smoothly. It doesn't need to be loose. In fact, there's no advantage in it being loose, because if it was loose, it would be knocked very easily. Your aperture would not be where you'd set it. You can see it's limited in how far it will open. It only opens to f3.5 in this shutter. Without this, that shutter would be capable of opening out to effectively an f2 position. But there you go. That's that all in place. That's ready to go. Alright, next we can get the flash contact and so forth in position. So we've got this little standoff here that goes on here. The flash contact went on there. This catch, I'll give that a clean before I put that on. Just going to wipe that with some naphtha. If this catch is sticky with grease or oil or dust or something, the shutter won't cock correctly, it won't stay cocked. That looks fine. We'll put it back in the shutter. It sits up on here on those two posts. There's a plain screw goes at this end. And at the other end we have a spring and a shoulder screw. The spring needs to be able to move freely around that shoulder. You need to check that to make sure that that spring is free to move, that it's not trapped. Spring at the other end. And now I need to hook that spring around behind this arm. This arm has a little notch in the back of it. That spring needs to drop into that notch. So, pick the end of the spring up with my tweezers, bring it round, drop it into that notch. This lever is now sprung loaded, and that's the catch that holds our main cam in the cocked position. Here's our shutter release lever. I'm just going to take some molybdenum paste on a toothpick. Just give this a very, very light wipe on the shaft. And drop this into position. Drops into that hole there. The spring needs to be tucked down inside the edge of the case. Doing that with the tip of a screwdriver. And this tip here needs to be underneath this lever. Just check that that spring is seated down in the hole, so that our shutter release is activated by this pin here. That's rotated in the camera body. But basically when you release the shutter, this comes down, which allows your B lever to drop into engagement, but it also lifts this catch. Okay, so that's all looking good. Here's our main cam. I'll just clean that to get rid of all the old grease. The main reason you get rid of old grease is that it will have gathered up dust and dirt over time, and it will be transformed from a lubricant to a grinding compound. And since we don't want things to wear away any quicker than they have to, it's good to get that old grease off and lubricate it with something else. Now here I'm using molybdenum paste. You could use graphite grease. This outside curved surface here, give that a wipe. That's where it runs against the retard gear train. And I usually just give a wipe up through the middle and wipe to those other two surfaces, and we can drop this thing into place. Okay, so that sits in there. In its cocked position, of course we haven't got its spring on it at the moment, in its cocked position this comes round and you see that this lever flipped out of place and is now holding it. When we release the shutter, our shutter release comes in here, lifts this arm, which allows this to roll back, which picks up the studs on the blade actuating ring. As it comes round, it picks up the other stud there, and then that pulls it round to the closed position. We'll get to those two studs and I'll just give them a touch of molybdenum paste. Here on the blade actuating ring, you can just see one. There's that one there, and this one here. And while I've got this in my hand, I'm just going to put a wipe on that detent spring, which you see down in here. That's good, that sounds nice. Let's put that main cam back in position. It's in its park position round there. And that brings us to the question of the spring. Now the spring is tired. That's the same spring as you would see on a synchro compor shutter. It's a little bit tired. In days of old, when parts were readily available and these cameras were comparatively current, say in their first 20 years, if you were doing a shutter overhaul, you would replace that spring as a matter of course. These springs are a bit hard to track down. The last lot I got, I think I paid $15 US each for them, and that was a couple of years ago. They don't crop up very often. But I've got an answer to that, because what we're mostly concerned about is because it's tired at its rest position, when the blades are, when it's back in its rest position almost, that's when it's got the least tension on it. And if the shutters are even a little bit sticky, it might be reluctant to pull the blades fully closed reliably. So we need to change our rest position here, and basically what I'm going to do is put this in a little tool I've got and unwind that spring so that our point here on this end, instead of being at the 3 o'clock position or about 3:30 position, is at about the 2 o'clock position, which is much closer to what it should have been. And that would mean that in its rest position it has more tension just at that point. Okay, here I've got a little tool I've made some time ago to help me unwind these springs. The problem with trying to unwind something like this is if you just grab hold of one end and try untwisting it, you'll inevitably end up with a distorted mess. We want something that retains its shape. So I made this little tool which allows me to do this. Now our rest position, when this thing is sitting where it should be, these two yellow dots should be aligned. So if I can twist that slightly, a little bit more. If you overdo this, you'll end up in trouble. So we're getting closer. Let's see what I've got. Okay, so if that pin's at the 12 o'clock position, this is now at about 2:30, so we're about half of the way where we want to be, and the spring is important. Most importantly, the spring is not bent into some sort of ugly shape. Oh, you can see that's just about there. It's important not to overdo this. I think we might call that done. Okay, so there, with one leg at the 12 o'clock position, this is sitting at about the 2 o'clock position. Now that is pretty much like a bought one. So at that point, I'll take this spring, give it a light wipe with molybdenum paste through the centre, and we'll put it into the shutter. And one of the unfortunate aspects of life as we know it is that these springs are much more convenient to fit when they are worn out. Now so I get that spring in there, that little pin on the bottom drops into that hole. Yeah, that hole that you can see right there. And the other end we've got to pick up and lift around behind that post there. And this is where it gets entertaining. That just popped out of its hole at the bottom. That's the one part of it. Let's see if we can get this thing over there. This is something that's always awkward with these springs when they are in good condition. Lift that arm up, come right across and tuck it down into that catch there. So now that spring is in position. We've just about got this done. I'm going to give this arm here, this catch, a wipe of molybdenum paste. Now, if I swing this round, it latches into position. If we release the shutter fires. Now, it didn't close on as it would do for the B position, because basically there was nothing slowing it down, and that shutter blades were already on their way back before the B lever had a chance to drop in. Once the retard gear trains are installed, that's not a problem. But that's a sign that everything's working nicely there, and that shutter is ready to have its speed trains put back in place. Well, here's our retard gear train, and here is our self timer or delay action. We'll just see if that delay action runs down. Yeah, it does, but it's pretty reluctant. And the retard gear train, that's not looking happy. It should return to the rest position by itself, but that's exceptionally reluctant to do so. The pin here can be used to make adjustments for your speed adjustment. I'm just looking at that because that's pretty much bent out of shape. And I'll probably square that up before I make any adjustments when we put it back in the camera. Both of these devices I'm going to stick in my ultrasonic cleaner. So what I've got is a tiny little jar, which I think originally came to me filled with anchovies or something like that. And I just immerse these in naphtha inside that little jar, and then I place that little jar in my ultrasonic cleaner where it's surrounded by water up to probably about halfway, and I'll just give those 10 minutes and let that run, and basically that'll blow any old oil, old dried oil or lubricants or dust out of there, and these should be left. Once I pull them out and blow them out with the rocket blower, they'll be dry and clean. And from that point I just need to lubricate them, and I typically use graphite powder for that, and we can install them in the shutter. Right, well these are back from cleaning. Let's see if we've made any impression on how they work. I haven't lubricated them yet. I'm going to do that with graphite powder. Let's just see if this runs. It's not doing a thing. Might be still wet. Let's try this. That's doing nothing either. That's exactly as we left it. Oh, you can see how sluggish that is. That's moving, but it's just barely chugging along. That's interesting. I'll give that a little bit of lubrication. We'll see how it behaves. At least it's moving now. Well, its mate over here is not doing much. Doing nothing. Oh, there it goes. Alright, I'll lubricate those with graphite powder. So what I normally do is just take them, drop a bit of graphite powder in there, hold the lever back that allows it to run. Give it a poke to get it started and let it run. This is really reluctant. Oh, there it's away. Basically what's happening there is that the graphite is doing a couple of things. One of the things is it's lubricating the surfaces of the gears where they run over each other. But it's also getting into those spindles. Now these are not really like watches, they're not jeweled. Pivots. That's how it should run down, that's working well now. Rub a little bit into those pivot points. Give that a spin. That's good. That's smooth. There's no sign of any hesitation there. So what I want to do is work that another half a dozen times, and then I'm going to be very carefully blowing out all the graphite powder. And I've got to do the same with this speed train. If I can find the appropriate tweezers for picking that graphite powder up with. Oh, they've gone AWOL. Okay. If I hold this tab back towards the post, that disengages the pallets, and I can work this graphite into the gears. It's moving quite smoothly now. I'm just going to push a bit of graphite into those pivots. I think there's fixed axles on this end. Let's see how we go now. Yeah, that's running down by itself now, you see that? That's how it should work. Should be smooth. Right. Well, I think I can blow off that excess graphite powder. There's a bit of corrosion here. That nickel plating is lifted at that point. Means that it's been subject to some moisture at some stage, I'd say. This seems to work quite well. Alright, well, I'll work that graphite into those gear sets a little bit more, and I'll blow them out and we can put them into the shutter.